and good afternoon. Welcome to another session of the Department of Economics virtual seminar. I am Orkide Gargozli from the Department of Economics. I'm an assistant professor, and I have a co-host here, Dr. Edmund Berisha. He's an assistant professor from Economics Department. It is our honor to introduce our guest today, Dr. Branko Milanovic. Branko is currently a visiting presidential professor at the Graduate Center CUNY and a senior scholar at the Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality. So I met, I had the pleasure to be his student in his Global Income Inequality course in 2017, and it was one of the most profound learning experiences that I have ever had. Branko obtained his PhD in economics in 1987 from the University of Belgrade with a dissertation on income inequality in Yugoslavia. He served as lead economist in the World Bank's research department for almost 20 years, leaving to write his book on global income inequality, Worlds Apart, in 2005. He was a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington from 2003 to 2005, and he has held multiple teaching appointments in distinguished universities such as University of Maryland, Johns Hopkins University, and he was a visiting scholar at Oxford University. Dr. Milanovic's main area of work is income inequality in individual countries and globally, including in pre-industrial societies. He has published articles in prestigious journals such as Economics Journal, Review of Economics and Statistics, Journal of Economics Literature, Journal of Political Philosophy, and many more. One of his books, The Haves and the Have-Nots, in 2011 was selected by the Globalists as the 2011 Book of the Year. Another one of his books, Global Inequality, in 2016 was awarded the Bruno Kreisky Prize for the best political book of 2016. And it was translated into 16 different languages. The book addresses economic and political effects of globalization and introduces concepts of successive Kuznets waves of inequality. In March 2018, Branko was awarded the 2018 Leontief Prize for Advancing the Frontiers of Economic Knowledge, and his new book, Capitalism Alone, was published in September 2019. So once again, it is an honor and a pleasure to having you here. Thank you so much for being here, and we look forward for your talk.
Well, thank you very much, Orkide. Thank you, Edmund, also for co-chairing this conversation. We hope, of course, that technology will stay with us and that we will be able to carry this to its end. The plan, as Orkide said, actually is for me to speak for about 30-35 minutes. I may not cover all the slides. Actually, I'm very happy to send you the slides and you can use them or share them. But of course, with attribution, don't forget that. But if I don't finish them, of course, we might cover some during the conversation. The structure of the talk, which is titled as global recent trends in global income distribution and political consequences of those trends, is such that I would actually first say something which is a theme from the more recent book, Capitalism Alone, and where that book basically takes two major developments into account. The first one, that capitalism is now the only mode of production around the world, which of course nobody is very much surprised by that, except of course then people question whether China also belongs to that. And of course I do answer that question in the affirmative, because by objective criteria such as the share of labor force which is working in the private sector, the production of value added which is contributed by the private sector, and so on, actually China has the characteristics which are more or less characteristics of European countries or Turkey in the 1980s. But what is also interesting is that with the end of socialism, there is no other mode of production, no other way in which you organize production except capitalism. Again, if you go back before the World War I, you obviously had other ways which were basically serfdom and slavery which existed at that time. We now, of course, hear a lot about, of course, slavery. And the fact is that in the United States, it existed until 1865, in Brazil until 1888, in Russia, serfdom until 1861, in Central Europe until 1848, serfdom as well. So we have to realize that actually capitalism then was sharing the world with other modes of production. And then it was sharing the world with socialism. Well, since 1990 approximately, it is not sharing the world with anyone because it's the only mode of production. So that's a big change, historical change. The second big change is the reemergence of Asia. That, of course, is known to everybody because of the importance of China, and I will show some of the Chinese, data and the numbers. I have recently had paper with two authors that looks actually at the top 5% of China, how much it has changed in the composition of people who are really there, the top 5% over the last 25 years. But it is actually broader. It is basically not only China, it's countries like Vietnam, India, Indonesia, Thailand, and all the others that are catching up with the rich Western countries. Obviously, they're still much poorer, but there is unmistakable catch up, which now has been lasting for more than a generation, or in some cases like China with 2 generations. So then I would actually say something about the changes between 1988 and 2008, and then I will now call. I'm actually talking about global inequality first. And global inequality, as I said, is the inequality between world citizens. It seems both kind of easy and kind of not very clear. The way that we get the data about global inequality is we actually we depend on 100 and plus countries producing household surveys. Now, these household surveys historically were not done annually, so basically you also had the problem there that you would not have the data from, like, suppose 100 and plus countries annually. But recently, and I might say recently, I mean like in the last 20 years, we are actually having more and more countries producing the data annually. Then essentially you have to compile this data. You have also to convert incomes in local currency. You have to convert them into what is called international dollars or PPP dollars, so that you would have the same purchasing power wherever, technically, whether you're in Brazil, US, Malawi, or anywhere. So it's as you can see, it's a huge exercise in terms of data. I recently did a paper which actually looked at the most recent numbers for 2013. I'm actually now doing with 2018, but as I said, it is lots of work. Now, people have done it all the way to 1820, and that's unfortunately the slide that I cannot show you, but obviously we didn't have surveys in 1820, but we have some estimates which come from social tables. Now, social tables are the tables where you have a list, you list the most important, what they call salient social groups and their mean incomes. So essentially you have then the social table, for example, for the UK, they started producing them from 1688, and then you would have at the top, the highest aristocracy, like the king and people around him, how many people were there, what is their estimated income. Then you have like a big time, aristocracy, then small aristocracy, I mean, all kinds of different nobilities, then merchants and so on. So you can actually piece out somehow or tease out some data about within national income inequalities, even going back to the period of Napoleonic Wars. Basically, the data start from 1820. And then you have, for GDP per capita, we have the Madison project data that was, of course, originated by Angus Madison, who produced the first estimates based, of course, on hundreds of other people who have worked, estimates of GDP per capita. So some of you who follow me on Twitter might have noticed that yesterday I was actually tweeting some new data from Madison because the new round of Madison data just came out. So basically, for historical purposes, for historical data, we then have two sources in order to create income in a global income inequality. We have Madison's data on GDP per capita, and then we have these social tables or estimates for different groups of countries, because obviously we don't have in 1820 too many of these estimates. So Francois Bourguignon and Christian Morisson, the two researchers, have put then an estimate that we are still using with some modifications, but basically using how global inequality has changed from 1820 to the end of the 20th century almost, to 1990. And then afterwards, I together with Christoph Lackner have actually brought this up all the way to 2013. Now, when you look at that slide, which again, unfortunately, I cannot show, what you notice is that global inequality has risen very significantly throughout the 19th century. So you basically have really sort of significant increase in global inequality. It starts with the Gini coefficient of the world, which is high for individual country, but it's not that high for the world. The Gini of about 50, which means it's like a Gini that currently exists in countries in Latin America. So the world was like that. But why did the Gini or inequality in the world increase throughout the 19th century? It increased simply because some countries, meaning essentially West European countries and the US and later Japan, became much richer. As they became much richer, they really pulled away from other parts of the world, and in particular pulled away from China and India, which have, of course, lots of population, but China and India did not grow in the 19th century. Moreover, China actually went down. So what then happened is that you have a massive increase in global inequality. It's a little bit what I called like a big bang. You had the Industrial Revolution that launched on this trajectory of growth, West European countries and later North America, and created massive gaps in incomes between them and Asia. And of course, lots of population of the world was located in Asia. It traditionally was the part of the world with very high population density. So that really it was one element that led to this explosion of inequality globally in the 19th century. The second element was within individual countries, inequalities also went up because of the Industrial Revolution. Of course, we know that for the UK, we know for the United States, the 19th century was a period of large increase in inequality. In a different work that I'm doing now, I look actually at this in UK inequality in the 19th century when Ricardo was writing the Principles and when Marx was writing Capital, and it was actually increasing all the way to 1870 approximately. So to summarize, the global inequality in the 19th century is rising for two reasons. First, because the countries of what became the first world became really rich thanks to the Industrial Revolution, and the rest of the world really did not improve at all, and in the case of China, even went down. And secondly, within national inequalities went up. So you really have both elements between national inequality and within national inequality pushing global inequality up. Then you come to the First World War and the entire 20th century, and I will cover that very quickly, because there you essentially don't have much of a change. You have global inequality staying at a very, very high level, but it's a plateau, so it doesn't really go down or up. And you have a sort of a tripartite division of the world, which to people like myself, when we were born, it seemed to us like a natural division of the world, but it was a division that was created in the 19th century. And that division was the rich countries of the West, then the socialist countries that were actually poorer than the rich countries, and the countries of the tricontinental, if you will to call it, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, that were poorer than the first two categories and had lots of people. So really the level of inequality then remained very high, but it didn't change. Then finally we enter the third period, which is actually the current period. And that period we enter basically by the last decade of the 20th century. And it's originally driven mostly by China, is that basically the catch-up of Asia that I mentioned in the beginning of the talk is then reflected in the reduction of global inequality. So I want to emphasize that because many people ask me, and it's not clear to them, that we are talking so much about inequalities today, but at global level, inequality is going down when you measure incomes across the entire world population. There could be, I have to say, there could be some parts of the distribution. Let's suppose the part of distribution which is the top 1%, which might become sort of less unequal because the very rich people are like the global plutocracy are obviously getting, the billionaires are getting richer and richer. But when you actually take a synthetic measure of inequality, which takes into account everybody's income, then obviously the rising middle class in China, Vietnam, India, and elsewhere has a preponderant effect on that. And then you have currently a decline in global inequality, which is actually quite fast. And on the other hand, an offsetting element, which is the rising within national inequalities. So let me then contrast, if you know, the current period with the period number 1 of the 19th century. The similarities are that in both cases, you had an industrial or technological revolution. The difference, though, is that that technological revolution then was very favorable to the Western countries because they actually became gradually much richer, and that created global inequality. The current revolution is much more favorable to Asian countries, and they are catching up. So it's like a mirror image. What actually pushed global inequality in the past is now pushing global inequality down, meaning the Asian sort of renaissance, if you will. So that's how global inequality looks like now. Now you can actually ask me, and I want to move to this next. How was it affected first by the crisis in 2008, and how that was of course purely speculative, so I will not do that in the talk. How could it be affected by the coronavirus crisis? Before I come to that, let me go so now I'm now focusing on the more recent periods. Let's go to the period between the end of the Berlin Wall and the end of communism. Actually, the data that Christoph Lackner and I were using start actually by accident largely, in 1988, which comes as a very good date, and they end in 2008 at the time of the financial crisis. So that high globalization, what was it? What did it produce in terms of income inequality? Now, the graph that became quite well known from that work was the so-called the elephant chart. Now, the elephant chart, to some extent, somebody drove an elephant, so it does look a little bit like an elephant. But the point of that chart is really three groups of people who have had experienced very different outcomes during these 20 years of high globalization. If you look at the middle of the income distribution, you actually obviously have there countries from Asia and so-called Asian middle class. People from Asia middle class are not like Western middle classes in terms of their income. They are actually much poorer, but they're globally in the middle. So these are people who have income, for example, which would not be in the US considered, it would be far from the middle class because they would have income on per capita per day of between $5 and $15 or at most $20 per day. That obviously in the US is basically even below the poverty line. The poverty line in the US is about $15, $16 per day. So globally, however, they're in the middle simply because the world is a relatively poor place, particularly if you look at the world with sort of estimates of incomes from the rich side, from the US. So these guys in the middle of the global income distribution are mostly from like rising Asian countries. China obviously is the number one, but also, as I said before, Vietnam, India, and so forth. So they have had a very good period over these 20 years, and that period has continued all the way to 2013, for which I have the most recent data, and most likely all the way to 2018. So that is basically pushing an increased kind of a global middle class, but it's also rising position of Asia. And one thing that is very important to understand, and you ask me later if it's fully understood because it's really tricky part, as these people in Asia become richer, obviously they're not going to stay in the middle of where they are now and where they were around that middle for the last 20 years. They're going to start moving into the upper portion of the global income distribution. Well, that would be something new. And this is one of the issues with which, of course, the West has to deal, is that the Western middle classes at the same time have had very slow growth. So when you have that on a graph, what you notice is you have people in the middle of the income distribution with very high growth, and these are people from Asian countries, and then you have richer people from the Western countries, including the United States, that are richer, but they have like almost zero growth. So there is this kind of a tension between people who are poorer than you, but who oftentimes do the similar jobs and same jobs that you, who are that in competition with you, and who are actually growing faster than you. So what would happen, it's already happening at some point, but it would happen more and more in the next generation, is that those people from Asia would move into what was generally considered like a sort of basically a Western domain, where was actually because the Western incomes were generally in the top 20% of the global income distribution. Even if you were a relatively poor person in France or Germany or the Netherlands, you would still be in the global 20%. Well, that's going to change in the 20 or 40 next years, because more and more people from Asia would move there. Now, we are talking about ranks. So if somebody moves into my rank, that means I have to move down. Even if our incomes, for example, if my income in real terms is still increasing, but if it is actually increasing less than somebody else, I would have to move down. So that would be, I think, quite a significant change. And when I talk about political implications, I think this is a very clear political implication, is that you would have, as I said, actually within the next 20 years, you would have large chunks of the Western populations, middle class and lower middle class and so on, who would no longer be in the top quintile of the global income distribution. And this is something that has not happened in the last 200 years. So just to give you an idea, an Englishman or English person or English woman in the early 19th century, even if they were poor, except for example, the very bottom of the English distribution that were vagrants and beggars and others. But even if you were a worker by mid-19th century, and that's actually very clear in Marx's and Engels's writing, because they were actually a little bit puzzled by the fact that the English working class is now actually becoming richer and the wages are going up. So these people would be at the lower part of the British income distribution, but they would not be at the low part of the global income distribution. They would be actually somewhere in the middle, and actually, as I was saying before, in the 20th century, they would be in the top 20% of the global income distribution. Well, that's going to change. So that's a big political change, which has many implications, including the fact that you would have in Western countries like the US, or let's suppose Germany and others, you would have the situation that is similar to the situation that exists in Latin American countries today. You know, what is special about Latin American countries? It's of course that they have very high inequality, but also that people from those countries really belong to the different slices of global income distribution. You have people at the top in Brazil who are part of the global top 1%. You have a very large middle class, upper middle class in Brazil that belongs to the 90th percentile globally. But then you also have in Brazil people who are at the bottom of Brazilian income distribution, who are at the bottom of the world as well. So there are people who will be there who are like in the bottom 5% globally. So not such radical change would happen in the Western countries, but there would be a change where the people who are in the lower parts of the income distribution in the US would now become around the median of global income distribution. And that's not something that they have traditionally been, you know, their position was much higher. So then let me then move to the third point, which is important in the elephant chart, and that's the point of the global top 1%. Now, these people have, they come mostly from Western countries. For example, US represents 1/2 of the population in that global top 1%, which also means that about between 10 and 12% of Americans are actually part of the global top 1%. So you may not be in the US, you may not be in the US top 1%, but you can still be in the global top 100%. because obviously the requirements for you to be in the global top US percent means that you have to be richer than, if US has 330 million people, you have to be richer than 327 million people. But when it comes to the global income distribution, the requirement is of course less, because the global top 1% includes more than 70 million people. So the global top 1%, which, as I said, is mostly dominated by Western countries, although we have already Chinese, Indians, Russians, Brazilians, as I mentioned, entering there. I think there are, in the latest numbers that I had, there were about 4 million Chinese out of the 70 million in the world who are in the top 1%. These people have had actually very good period between 1988 and 2008. Now, the crisis actually has not been good for them. And we see that in the US data as well. There was a decline in real incomes of the top 1%, essentially because their incomes largely derive from capital. So if you had a decline in interest, profits, and then interest, dividends, and so forth, even if you don't include capital losses, you still have had a very low growth for those people at the top. And they recovered only by 2013. So essentially what happened to the plutocratic top of the global income distribution was that in the period of high globalization between the fall of the Berlin Wall and the financial crisis, they had an extremely good period where their percentage gains were paralleling the percentage gains of the middle class Asians. Now, this is quite extraordinary because if they grew by 80% over these 20 years, that meant that actually their absolute gains were enormous, because obviously they start with very, very high level of income. When you're in the middle income of the income distribution and your per capita income per day is $10, even if you double your income or triple, as some Chinese did, you gain $20 or $30 per day. But if you start with your income of being $400 per day and you double, then of course you would have realized $400 in absolute terms. I mean, a very huge increase. So that's what happened with the global plutocracy. But then the crisis in 2008 was a bad news for them. They didn't have growth, and they actually basically recovered only by 2013. And some preliminary data, mostly from the US and rich countries, suggest that actually they have then recovered between 2013 and 2018. They started growing again. But the shape in that sense might have remained the same as the elephant shape between 1988 and 2008. Let me once again summarize. So that will be high growth rate in the middle of the income distribution, thanks to Asia. Absence of growth among the lower parts of the income distributions in the West, and return to high growth at the global top 1%. So that, I think, is broadly the shape with which we entered the COVID crisis. And now we don't know, obviously, how that COVID crisis will affect the world, but I want to maybe finish my sort of talk by pointing out to two interesting points about the future. First, obviously, I spoke a lot about China, and China played, of course, crucial role there. It is, if you take China out, for example, for a significant period of time, then global inequality, which I mentioned, has been going down since 1990, actually would not be going down. So China alone was really doing the work of reducing global inequality. However, this is coming, or it's actually already came to an end, because China, by doing that, has moved towards the middle income country status and has moved its population towards the higher positions in global income inequality. So then you have a change situation. China nowadays is really neutral as to the global income inequality. In other words, high growth rate of China is no longer going to produce the reduction in global income inequality, because China is now too rich to do that. And when China sort of increases its income, it actually makes itself further apart from countries like Nigeria, Sudan, Ethiopia, Burma, and others that actually, or India, that are left behind. So Chinese, I have to emphasize that Chinese role in global income distribution has now come to an end. It would actually start soon adding to global income inequality. But that means, and that's my first point, that another country, which is India, now should play, and we hope will play, the role that China played in the last 40 years. In other words, India's growth is now going to be, we hope, that engine or global income reduction that China was in the past. Because obviously India is much poorer than China. I don't have the slides because I cannot show you, but it's very, very clear when you put, different parts of the Indian population and compare them to the equivalent position in China, that of course India actually is inferior at every point of its own income distribution compared to the similar people in China. So India's role becomes crucial. And in that context, the fact that India's growth this year because of COVID would be strongly negative, it's really bad news, both for global poverty and global income inequality. And the second point, and I will finish with that, is the role of Africa. So far I've spoken of all of this, but I barely mentioned Africa. And the reason is that Africa did not play a very significant role in this sort of global permutations, partly because it remained poor, so it really didn't move very much among, up or down, and it actually did not have a population size in the 19th century that could make a huge dent one way or another, unlike, for example, India or China. Now that is changing because, as you know, Africa is the only continent which will have a very significant increase in population. And unless Africa starts converging, which means really doesn't mean really becoming equal, but at least having growth rates that are higher than the growth rates of the rich countries, we might have the situation that Africa, if it fails to do that, would add to global inequality. So Africa is really, I think, should be now at the focus of our thinking, because if you have growth rates of 2 and 2.5% of population, and if for convergence, some type of convergence, you need to replicate somewhat growth rates of China or in India, or I suppose 5% per capita, that means that you would really have to grow by 7 to 8% annually. That's not easy at all. So whether Africa would be able to achieve, and when I say Africa, that I know it's a huge simplification, until only recently we were actually using Ethiopia as a great example, because it was a country that really had same record of growth, like China almost, had growth rates of 10% per year for 2 decades. But now with, of course, possible civil war in Ethiopia, that could change. So, Africa is obviously many countries, but really the big countries that I mentioned before, Nigeria, Sudan, Ethiopia, Congo, obviously South Africa, they are actually the engines, and their role would become absolutely crucial in the 21st century to reduce both global poverty and global inequality. So I think I should stop there. As I said, I'm really sorry that there was no slides. I would send the slides to Orchid and to Edmund, so you guys are most welcome to share them. So you might actually remember some of my talk when you look at the slides, but I will stop here, and then I would actually have the Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much. I want to thank you for making it work without, the PowerPoints. I know it's going to be tough, but thank you so much. It was a very interesting talk, especially that you do a multinational comparison. It's very interesting to me, because usually we are focused in one country, such as US, but when you talk about global income inequality, it actually opens doors. I have some questions. Well, first of all, one of them is that, like, from your expertise after all these research and studies, what is the relationship between growth, economic growth, and income inequality? Is it so what I understand is that globally growth is beneficial for inequality, but within a country we are not sure if everybody is equally benefiting from the growth in economics, like GDP. So if you want to simplify the relationship between growth and income inequality, what would you? What
Yeah,
would you say?
it's a difficult question. I will be very brief on that.
Yes.
Obviously, for global inequality, as my talk, I think, made clear, we need growth. I mean, growth is absolutely, sine qua non for the reduction of global inequality. The irony is that actually that you start by worrying, as I do, about global inequality, but you really end up by arguing about growth of poor countries, because that's really what is going to reduce global inequality. There is no redistribution. There is no global redistribution. Global aid, I have to disappoint people, but global aid is really, in America, we say peanuts, but it's not peanuts. It's much less than peanuts. That global aid is not going to make any difference. So it's really growth of the countries that would make. Now, when you come to within individual countries, that of course is a huge topic. You would probably have people who would give the whole, lecture or several lectures. I just want to say that recently, unlike in the past, where the emphasis was that high inequality may be the cost of high growth. In other words, people were arguing you have to have high inequality so that the rich people save, so that they can invest, so that we can grow. That's a very classical model. I mean, this is the model of Ricardo, and going back to Howard Domer and all of, the growth economics. Well, more recently, I think that we have come to a more nuanced position where you see that actually in some cases, there are several papers, including I had a paper with Roy van der Weide, that essentially what could happen is that if we have high inequality, that leaves some portions of the population out, and that actually is associated also with social separatism of the rich, which means they don't invest in any interested in any investment in infrastructure, or it might lead to a social instability, or political control by the rich. So there are all these elements that might actually lead to a negative relationship, in the sense that higher inequality might be related to lower growth. So I think we have moved from that relatively simple view of the world, where essentially you need to have inequality in order to generate savings, in order to have accumulation and investments, to a view of the world where you see very many negative effects that can be brought up, social and other effects that can actually reduce growth. So I think that's currently what my understanding of the relationship is.
Yes, thank you so much. So focusing on the United States, I know your research is more focused on global income inequality, but the last Thanksgiving was called a billionaire Thanksgiving by some news agencies, because like after the pandemic, the U.S. billionaires, their capital accumulation was more. Wealth is twice the amount of wealth held by the bottom 50% for the top billionaires in the U.S. So they gained $1 trillion since March 2020 post-pandemic. So I know we are at the earliest stages, of understanding the economic effect of this pandemic, but what is your understanding of the future of income inequality in the US? Is it scary, or is it, going to be more balanced?
Well, if you're Jeff Bezos, it's not scary. It's actually very reassuring.
Exactly.
So,
I'm
so
not a
I
billionaire, so it would be scary for me.
I um, I was recently, I mean, in the last 10 years, working more in the US because, as Edmund, who showed very kindly the Capitalism Alone book, the whole chapter deals essentially with the US income inequality. Uh, what has happened during the crisis now, and of course it's not over, we don't know really what will be the real final effect of the crisis, but I think that it took many people by surprise. First, we obviously did not expect the pandemic to happen. Secondly, this is a modern pandemic. People in the beginning, including myself, we sort of knew pandemics in the past. Walter Scheidel has a book, about the factors that lead to a decline of inequality. And of course, in the past, pandemics, and the famous pandemic of the Black Plague, reduced inequality, but they reduced inequality in a pattern that we really don't want to replicate, is by killing people. So if you had, as you did have in Europe, 1/3 of the population being killed, what happened was that the labor became much more scarce, so the wages went up. And actually, what was interesting, because it was a feudal Europe, the power of landlords over the workers or peasants went down simply because peasants had many other alternatives and they would escape from the domains. So, that was our sort of thinking, but this is obviously a different world. So it led, as you said, actually to incredibly high gains to people who actually, who had ownership of things that became so valuable during the pandemic, in the case, of course, of Jeff Bezos. So it could well be that actually inequality in the US would be increased because of the pandemic. And, it could be particularly if there is no further or sufficiently important attempts to compensate people who have lost their jobs and who actually are being redundant or furloughed and so on. But as I said, I think we should hopefully the pandemic would not last more than whatever year and a half or something. So I think that the recovery would be hard, but this is still a very unique event. Now, whether that event would actually set in motion negative things, in the sense that actually we would not be able to get back that money from the very rich by taxation, which could easily be the case, then we might have even a further reinforcement of the position of the plutocrats at the very top of the wealth distribution. So that could happen. It's difficult to see now that there will be policy actions that will be taken to, for example, tax wealth more than it is being done now.
Yeah. So you mentioned taxes. I wanted to ask you the next question. Like, what are like the traditional tools that we have, such as raising the taxes or monetary and fiscal policies? Which one do you think is more helpful or more appropriate, at least for the United States economy at this point?
This is a very difficult question. We do have, and I will not go because you all know the tools.
Yeah.
When people say, "How do we reduce inequality?" It's known. It's like there are the tools. It's like you ask, "How do we fix a car?" We know how to fix the car. The question is, are these tools politically sort of acceptable? Are the tools which would lead to a marginal tax rate of 50% acceptable? Is taxation of capital gains acceptable? I mean, at the rates much higher than what they're being now. Is taxation of capital to be at least equal to the taxation of labor acceptable, which of course was the case in the past? Is the increase in the minimum wage acceptable? Are investments in public education acceptable? So they're all the things that can be done, and we know that it can be done. The question is actually, is there political will to do that? An alternative, which is, of course, goes together, but it's ideological. An alternative is something that I write about in Capitalism Alone, is to focus on endowments. In other words, on two types of endowments: on what young people get in their own inheritance and capital that they get from the family, and opening up public education to everybody. When I say obviously it is open now, but what we would actually need is to have a public education being better than private. So in that sense, you would not need to get the best education or to get actually the education with a good stamp, which would give you a sort of very high paying job. You would not need to invest $50,000 a year, which very few people can. So this is actually, there was a nice book called by Daniel Markovich called the Meritocracy Trap. He's a law professor at Yale, and he actually really discusses exactly that influence that extremely highly expensive private schools have is essentially a monopoly mechanism of the rich to preserve the power. So, these are the things that can be done over the longer term. But as I mentioned, the deconcentration of capital ownership and the role of the public education are longer term projects. You cannot have the effects on that over 2 or 3 years. So this is like we are talking about a generation. Taxation, however, of course, can have an effect immediately.
Yes. Thank you so much for your response. One of our students asked, does the US middle class shrink in the near future? Because we keep hearing the middle class of the US is going to disappear. So how do you compare that while like the global income inequality is going down? What is your, perception of US middle class? Is it going to be
Yeah.
smaller
Well,
or?
it's easier for me, like for every economist, to speak about the past than about the future.
Yes,
We were
exactly.
oftentimes wrong about the future, So let me so say what happened in the past that we know. What happened in the past is that actually the US middle class indeed did shrink, So I don't think there is any doubt about that. If you define the middle class in a sort of conventional way, that you take the median income of the United States and you say, okay, I would call middle class everybody who is 25% above and 25% below. So you get a slice of the income distribution and say, how big is that slice? Well, that slice has shrunk. It used to be that 1/3 of the US population was within that range. Now it is only, I think, 22%, the latest numbers that I remember. So it has shrunk. Moreover, what is also interesting, not only has it shrunk, but its income there compared to the income to the mean of the US or to the top, obviously, has shrunk as well. So really the middle class has shrunk in two different ways. It has become smaller and it has actually become poorer compared to the mean. So there is no doubt about it. However, it does not mean only bad news, because when the middle class shrinks, it doesn't mean that people who lose the middle class status, they all go below. Actually, in the US case, out of 5 people who kind of were basically taken out of the middle class, 2 of them went up and 3 of them went down. So, it's not when the shrinkage itself does not mean that everybody gets worse off. Actually, some people leave the middle class to go to better places to become upper class. The problem, however, I think politically, is that if that happens, you do have increased polarization. And I think very often for that kind of development, I think the term polarization is better than inequality. Because what happens with the shrinkage of the middle is that you have more people at the top and more people at the bottom. So that means that actually polarization increases. And I don't think that if we continue having the policies that have been in practice in the last 40 years, I think that polarization might continue. Again, I'm saying it's not all bad because many people become richer. But the question is then, and of course people would speak of that now because of Trump and everything else, do we really basically, does the US basically then end up by creating two different ways of living, two different ways of thinking, two different types of consumption, where really the middle becomes kind of irrelevant because either you're on the one end or the distribution or the other. So I think that to me is a possibility.
Okay, thank you so much. And we have like the last question because we are running out of the time is people that make the most from capital also make the most from labor. Do we know what is driving this and is the system correctly rewarding skills and knowledge?
That's really, I mean, a great question. I love that question because it is one of the major themes of capitalism alone, is what I call homoplutia. That obviously the name comes from Greek. I just made it up and I talked to my Greek friends and they were not totally convinced at first, but when I explained to them, they say, well, we cannot find a better term, so use that. Homo means obviously the same in Greek, and then plutia means wealth. So what I wanted to convey is that nowadays, not only in the US, but in a few other countries, I've actually had a paper on this also, you have more and more people who are wealthy, who are in the top 10% by capital income and top 10% by labor income. And that's an entirely new development. I spoke about like, Marx type of capitalism. You didn't have capitalists then who were also workers. They were capitalists. They were actually making money from their own enterprises and companies and interest payments they were receiving and profits, obviously. But nowadays you have more and more people like that. And that's a very interesting phenomenon, which in some sense is good because you don't have that class segmentation. On the other hand, it makes it more difficult ethically, for example, to tax these people, because you can say, well, you observe that they work not 40 hours a week, but they work actually, they call them like in the modern Stakhanovites, you know, from Stakhanov in the Soviet Union, like they're working like 70, 80 hours a week. So how do you then justify really taxing them if they're really workers with very high wages? So it is at that class, I think, is actually becoming obviously more dominant. We now have about 30% of people who are in the top capital decile and also in top labor decile. And if you look at the more classically capitalist countries like Brazil and Mexico, that percentage is 7 or 8%. But the question is actually what will happen when we have like maybe everybody who is in the top decile by labor, really like CEOs, managers, designers and so on. And they're also software designers, and they're also in top 10% by capital because they have been able to save, or maybe they got the money from the parents. So then it really becomes like a new class. And the class which actually is very resistant to risk, because if you're rich both in terms of capital and your human capital and your labor, then you're very resistant to risk. Whatever happens to one factor of production is unlikely to happen to the other one. So that's a new phenomenon, and I'm glad it was asked, but I think it would really get more and more traction. And I think actually for some of the young people here, I really do think it's a topic that would be worthwhile studying in the US and other countries.
Yes. Thank you so much. Very interesting. So the rest of the questions, most of them are asking for the slides that you mentioned. So I'm going to wait for you to send it to me. Yes. And I want to thank you again. It has been a pleasure. I really enjoy talking, and I'm sure our audience have the same feeling. And that's it. So if I think we can wrap it now. Yes. So
thank you very much. Thanks again for the invitation. I mean, slides will be in the mail, as they say. But I'll send it to you, immediately today.
Sure.
So
thank you so much. And I will send you the recording. Yes. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thanks a lot. Thank you
so much, Professor Milan.
Bye, Milan.
Thank you very much, Edmund. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Orchid, for the idea.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.